Hi, and welcome to Quilting with Lori. My name is Lori Dickman, and today I'm going to be sharing with you part 2 of my log cabin on point quilt. I have so much to share with you today. This is going to be a huge quilt. Mine is going to be 92 by 92. In fact, I don't even have all of it on the wall here. My design wall is just not large enough for it. But you'll see a good portion of it here, and I'll continue bringing more as I can. I have most of it laid out upstairs on the floor. I'm using my large living room floor as my design wall for this. So let's talk about this quilt. The first part of this video I want to share with you is how many blocks I created, how many sashings I cut, how many cornerstones I cut. So I want to talk to you about that. The second part is a little bit more about layout. And I do recommend, if you have not yet watched part 1 of the Log Cabin on Point quilt tutorial, make sure you do that. The link is in the description box below. So watch that. It'll give you a whole lot more information that you'll want to be aware of so we can continue with this. And then the next part of the tutorial that I want to talk to you about is how I made my setting triangles and the setting corners. So we've got 4 setting corners that I'm going to make using my log cabin block as well as these setting triangles. And I want to share with you how I did that. I literally made log cabin blocks, and that's what I used to set all the way around. This is an entire quilt that's on point, so it needed setting triangles that you see here to finish it out, to square it up. And then I will be also talking about the borders options that I'm going to be using, and you can do any borders that you want. The PDF again gives you the information on the borders and the fabric requirements for this large quilt if you choose to do what I'm going to be doing. Okay, so the first thing I want to share with you is how many blocks that I made for this quilt. I made a total of 41 blocks. And a number of those blocks are going to actually be, they're on the outside edges and they're going to be cut. So I made entire blocks for each of my setting triangles. And then I'm going to share with you at the end of this video what I'm going to do with those leftover blocks that I've cut. It's going to be fun. So I've got 41 blocks that I have created for this quilt, and I did them in assembly line order. I would lay out about 4 to 8 of them on my table, put them all in rows, stack them, and I would just literally create each block. And by doing it in assembly line fashion, you can really put these blocks together quickly. So here is one of the log cabin blocks, and it's simply all 2.5-inch strips, which I subcut. So I grabbed my stash, subcut, well, I had a lot of 2.5-inch strips, and I needed a few different values, some more lights. I needed to cut up more lights because I ran out of the lights. Lights is a value that I use quite a bit of in many quilts. So I had to cut up some more 2.5-inch strips, and then I subcut those into the requirements. And part 1, as well as the PDF, part 1 of this video and the PDF itself will tell you exactly what measurements you need to cut those strips into so that you can create each and every block. And this is a log cabin on point. It is not a full log cabin. A full log cabin block would have the square in the center, and I discussed that in part 1. But it would have the square in the center, and then the logs would actually rotate all the way around the center square. This one is a log cabin on point. It's a quarter of a log cabin, basically, but really fun. Great one to make. So hopefully you've got your log cabin blocks ready to go, and you can start placing them in the layout that you desire. So speaking of layouts, let's take a look at the layout that I ended up going with. On my Facebook page, Quilting with Lori, Scrap Up Your Stash, I do have some pictures out there. You can check those out. I was trying different layouts. I had some of these laid out in squares, and then I finally went with rows. So I have rows of my brights, and I'm just going to call these brights. There are mediums and there are darks in those colored strips. And then these are my neutrals, or my lights. So I decided I'm going to go with rows for this particular quilt. And it's very important as you're laying out your blocks that you're careful about how you lay them. And you'll get the hang of it once you study it. But let me show you. Let's say I put this block on here like that. This last row is not yet sewn, so I can move that around. Right away, your eye should be able to pick up that the brights are now on the bottom here, and something has happened to the pattern. The pattern is no longer the way it should be. Now, you could maybe do some sort of a chevron with your log cabin blocks, and maybe that's what you need to do as you're working your way across the quilt. But in my case, I want my log cabin blocks to be in rows. Therefore, these have to follow this. Whoops, I've just lost my sashing. Let me grab another one here. So if you'll notice here, these lights are all going in this direction, and these brights are all going in this direction. So just check out your logs and see what layout they are laying in, and then make sure, study your entire quilt. As I was sewing this, I did have one mixed up in there and it wasn't laying properly. So make sure as you're sewing your rows together that you're making sure each block is in the correct, or that it's oriented properly. Now, with this quilt, we're actually sewing it in diagonal rows. The whole thing is simply diagonal rows. Starting at the very top, which I'm not able to get in the picture here, but there's a diagonal row of simply, there's going to be a corner, and then there's a diagonal row of a sashing with 2 setting corners. Then there's a diagonal row here, which has a setting triangle, a sash, a block, a sash, and a setting triangle. The next row is actually a sashing row, and it's simply the cornerstones and the sashing. That's all that it is. The next row is a setting triangle, a sash, a block, a sash, a block, a sash, etc., all the way up to the last setting triangle. So it's all done in diagonal rows, and you can just lay that back out either on your design wall if you've got a nice large one, or use a large floor if you're using or making a really large quilt like this one. All right, so I made a total of 41 of the blocks, complete blocks. I cut a total of 64 of the sashes. The sashes are 2.5 wide by 12.5 long. 64 of them are needed for the entire quilt. And then of the cornerstone, I cut a total of 40 of the cornerstones. So you're going to need 40 the cornerstones are all 2.5-inch squares. So they were subcut. I actually used fat quarters, which is what I had in my stash. I wanted that particular yellow, and then I had to use some other fabrics as well because I did run out. But 2.5-inch wide, these are squares, and these are strips that are 12.5 inches long. So I cut 64 of the sashes, 40 of the cornerstones. Now let's talk a little bit about the setting triangles and the corner triangles and how I created them using my log cabins. All right, so we're going to discuss this side of the log cabin. I think I'll stand over here so that you can see it a little bit better. So I've actually cut one of my log cabins in half. I've allowed a 1/4-inch seam allowance on there. I'm going to show you this. I'll take you to the tabletop here in just a minute and show you how I've done that. But as I was laying out this quilt, it was important to figure out how to fold my blocks so that they created the correct design. And for this side, I needed to make sure that I folded them so that my brights the logs were lining up with the row here. On the opposite side of the quilt, I needed to make sure that my lights were lining up with that. And then top and bottom, I literally had to place my log cabins and fold them like this. And that's how they were cut. And I'm going to take you to the tabletop and show you that. But the log cabin has to be cut based upon its location around the outer edge of your quilt. And you've got to ensure that the logs are in the correct orientation and that you're cutting the right side. I wouldn't want to place a light colored one here. In fact, if you look at this, I do have some brights there, but they're not facing the right direction. These brights are going this direction, and these brights are all going this direction. So that is not correct. I would not want to cut that in that position. I would want to do this. So I folded it like this. And there we go. Now you can see that my brights are all, I can't get it to stay. Now they're all positioned in the right direction, as you can see here. And that's what you've got to follow as you are laying out your outer blocks. And that's why I made sure I made full blocks. so that I could identify where it needed to be. And then the parts that I'm cutting away, I'm going to use those, and I'm going to show you at the end of the video tutorial how you can use those. Okay, if you take a look at these two, they were full blocks, which I had folded and then cut, and I allowed a seam allowance. Here is the one that is going to be used on the quilt, and this is a part that was cut away, so it's 1/4 of an inch shorter in this area because I left that 1/4 of an inch on the part that I cut away, and it's also on the design wall. And this was one that was at the top of the quilt, and you can see here that the logs are going in a little bit different direction. This is one that is going to be used on the side of the quilt, and the logs are going in a different direction. So that's why it's very important as you are working on each of the blocks for the setting triangles that you're very careful that you're cutting them on the right area. So let me show you what I did to make sure that I was cutting them properly. So here is a square. It's a full square. I've made full log cabins. They're all trimmed to squared up to 12.5 inches. Make sure you do square up each and every block to 12.5 inches. Now on this one, I put a pin on this side because I need this portion for my setting triangle to go on the wall, on the design wall. It's going to be a part of the quilt, which means that I'm going to cut this on the diagonal 1/4 of an inch on this side. So I'm going to be eating into this portion of the block, and that's okay. But I've got a creased line there, and what I'm going to do, hopefully you can see that creased line. I'm going to take my ruler. In fact, I'm going to flip it around here because I'm right-handed. This with the pin is the side that I need for the quilt. So I've got the pin there to make sure I'm not cutting into that side. And I'm finding that creased line, which you might not be able to see, but I can see it. I'm placing my ruler on here where I am allowing myself 1/4 of an inch onto this side. I need that seam allowance. So as you notice here, as I come along and I cut this, I have to move this over because my camera stand is in the way. I'm making sure that the 1/4 inch seam allowance is lined up right on the crease so that I'll have that additional 1/4 of an inch as the seam allowance. So there it's actually folding up on that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So that was cut from this side, which is fine. This side with the pin is what I need for my block. So I'm going to stack those on this side. It's going to be used in my block along with this one. This is extra, and I can have fun putting together all sorts of fun things. This creates an unusual design. If you were to put this together, I might want to do something even different. You can actually reuse these leftover pieces. The square, the finished square, is obviously going to be smaller. It's not going to be 12.5. I'd probably cut it to 10.5 once I get them all put together. But you can reuse these as just some real fun blocks. And I think what would be fun is to do some applique on the sides that are lights. So that's what I'm going to use all of these leftover parts for. Here is another full block. This pin identifies that I need this side of this block for my quilt. This is going to be the setting triangle. I have pressed a crease in it. So what I will do is flip it over. Again, here's the pin, so I know this is the side I need to keep. I need to cut a 1/4 inch seam allowance on this side of the crease. So I'm going to be cutting into this side. And again, I'll go ahead and do that. So that's how I will cut each and every one of my setting triangles. Now let's take a look at the setting corner. These are a little bit different. Again, you just got to follow the logs. In the case of my quilt, I've pinned them right here. This is the side right here that I need. It's got these pins in here identifying to me this is what I need right here. And in this case, the corner that this is going to be placed with, the logs are going this direction, and these are the brights. And I basically just folded this full log cabin on the diagonal again. But when I cut this, it's going to be cut a little bit differently, and I'll show you that. But depending on where the corner is, one of the corners will need this layout. One might need this layout with these lights going this way. One might need the lights going in a horizontal position, and one might need the brights going in horizontal. In this case, the brights are going in a vertical position. So what I did, I pressed a crease diagonally. I pressed a crease diagonally here. So there's some nice creases there. Now, let me show you how I'm going to cut this. Okay, so here again is the side that I need. I have my pins right there. I'm not sure if you can see them, but this is the area that I need, and I want to make sure that I add 1/4 of an inch seam allowance on both sides here, because I'm going to need that to attach this. Actually, this will be where the borders will be attached, but I'll need that. My 1/4 inch seam allowance is already there. That's already included in the block itself. So here's what I do. I have found my creases here. I'm going to grab a large, actually I want to use this side right here. I am lining up, I'm using the 1/4 inch seam allowance right inside here, and I'm lining that stitching line, if you will, that's on the ruler, on my crease. And that's how I will cut it. Now, in order for you all to see that, what I think I'm going to do is take an invisible pen here, and I'm going to draw where that crease actually is so that you can see it. All right, oops. There it is. So that is the crease that I have pressed into this block. But what I want to do, I want to make sure when I cut on this side of that crease 1/4 of an inch, and on that side of the crease 1/4 of an inch, because I need seam allowances out here. So I'm going to take this 1/4 inch, I'm going to call it a stitching line here on this square ruler. I'm going to line that up on that purple line, which is the crease. Let me get that done here. Okay, I think I've got it. And then my pins are actually in my way and making my ruler move, so I have to remove those. I do not want my ruler to move as I'm cutting this. Okay, I believe I have everything lined up. So now what I'm doing is cutting this so that I actually have seam allowances. And here you can see it. It's folding over. There's an additional seam allowance for that. And this will be a corner, one of the corners of my quilt. And what I'll do when I get back over to the quilt, I'll make sure that I line this up with a corner that needs the brights and that the logs are going in this direction. And I'll look at the entire quilt to identify which is the correct corner that this block will go. And I have this left over. So what I could do, again, I could just continue cutting this off right here, and it will measure the same as all these other cut pieces, and I can have fun creating a table runner. I think my plan is to make a table runner with this and just have fun with some beautiful applique flowers and very scrappy flowers and put that together. So you'll see that coming up here. All right, so that one was done. This is how I'm going to do every single corner. It's just like that. So let's say you are just using plain fabric for your corners, for your setting corners, as well as your setting triangles. So for this setting corner, basically what you could do is cut a 9-inch square, and you should be able to get 2 setting corners from your plain fabric. So that should work perfectly for you. So a 9-inch square cut on one diagonal, and you'd have 2 setting corners. So that's what you can do for that. And then for the triangles, what you might want to do if you're using plain fabric, and these measure 12.5 here, but what you could do is cut 13-inch squares, cut it on one diagonal, because then you have that additional 1/4 inch seam allowance that you need, and then you'd have your setting squares. So from one 13-inch square, you could cut it on the diagonal, and you'd get 2 setting triangles if you're using a plain fabric instead of using the log cabins. So for the setting corner, which is right here, cut a 9-inch square, cut on one diagonal, and for the setting triangles, cut a 13-inch square, cut on one diagonal, and in both cases you'll obtain 2 pieces. And then for the corners, you're going to need a total of 4. And for this, I'm not sure what the total is. Let me take a peek here. 3, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. You'll need 12. You'll need 12 of these, so cut 6 of the 13-inch squares. All right, now let me show you here how you're going to start sewing your diagonal rows together. The very first row is going to be just a corner, and here is my corner square. That's all that's going to be in that row. The second row is going to be a sashing row, and basically it's going to have a corner unit, a sash, and a corner unit. These will get squared off. These excess pieces here will get squared off when we're done putting the whole quilt together. But for the time being, I'm just leaving them as 2.5-inch squares. And what I'm going to do with each of these is press a crease in the center, find the center of this, and then make sure when I sew this on there, I match up those centers. Sew a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and then those 2 units will be put together. I'm going to go ahead and do that, and I'll be right back to the tabletop to show you the next diagonal row. All right, so I've got the next diagonal row laying here. I haven't yet attached my setting triangles, but I will do that. So here was our corner up here. It was the corner with the sashing. That was row 1, and this is row 2. Here is row 3. Row 3 is a setting triangle, a sash, a log cabin, a sash, and a setting triangle. And these setting triangles, you're simply going to line up the squared edge with the log cabin, right sides together, and we'll sew that in a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And over here, the same thing. I'm going to pull it in here so you can see it a little bit better. But I'm going to line up the edges here, the straight edges, with that, and sew a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. I'll do that, and I'll come right back to the tabletop. So if you take a look here, I have row 1 and 2, that's the corner of the quilt, and it is going to be attached to this. And this is row 3, which is the setting triangle, a sash, a complete log cabin, a sash, and a setting triangle. So when I sew this together, I'm simply going to match these up. The 12.5 inch and the sashes should match up just like that, the little cornerstones and the sashes. So I'm going to flip it like this, match up my seam allowances, and sew this together. So I'm going to sew that, and I will be right back to the tabletop. I now have row 1, which is just the corner of the quilt. I have row 2 attached, which is simply a sashing row. I have row 3 attached, which is 2 setting triangles and a block, because this is actually going to be the top of the quilt, and I guess I need to put it like this for y'all to see that as the top. This will be the top of the quilt, and it's all in diagonal rows. The next thing I want to do is row 4, which is another sashing row. And so I will simply match up this sashing row here and get that sewn on. And I'll just continue doing that. And at the top and the bottom of each of the rows, there will be a setting triangle, or you're going to have a corner in 4 areas as well. Now remember, we have put these 2.5 inch squares, these are all our setting square, or cornerstones, excuse me, that are going to be throughout the quilt. And on the edges of the quilt, you can simply cut them off right now if you want, or wait until you're completely done. But you can see that there's a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Let me make sure you see a close-up of that. There is a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, which is very important so that that square is sewn on there and you're not cutting off your points. So you can go ahead and trim that away right now if you like. In fact, I think that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to trim that off. And now my outside edge is square. Same thing over here. And now my outside edge is ready to go. Now I'm going to go back to the row 4 area here and add my sashing row. And I'm just going to continue adding diagonal rows until the quilt is all pieced together. And I do one row at a time. It's just so much easier, and I'm making sure that I'm not messing things up, especially when it comes to these rows that have your setting triangles and your log cabin blocks. Make sure as you're piecing them, put it back on your wall, make sure that everything is still oriented the way it's supposed to be. It's so easy to get something turned when you come back to your sewing machine. I wanted to give you some ideas of what you can do with the leftover blocks. Here you'll see I have a couple of them put together where I cut on the diagonal, and I'm going to sew them together like that. I'm going to add a couple of the other ones inside there, and I can continue doing that, making a centerpiece for my table, or I can continue making it longer and it will become an actual table runner. But it is another great way to use up your scraps. You can put in some beautiful vines and flowers that you can applique on here. There's so much that you can do with it. So be sure that you don't throw these pieces of log cabin that you have finished and cut away. Don't throw them away. Make sure that you save them and use them to make some more beautiful quilts. So I want to thank you so much for joining me for part 2 of the Log Cabin on Point quilt, and you can continue seeing its progress out on my Facebook page as I'm getting the rows on and so forth. I will post pictures so that you can get an update on what it looks like. I'll also be adding the borders, and on your PDF it does share with you the requirements, the fabric requirements. You will need 2 1/4 yards for the sashes and the inside border, and you'll need 1 1/4 yards for the outside border. And that depends also on what size you want to use. I am using for the inside border, it's a 2.5 inch jelly roll strip again, but I'm using scraps from my stash. And then I'm using a 4.5 inch cut or wide outer border from my stash. And I haven't decided yet what color fabric. Once I get the quilt pieced, once I get the first border on, which is going to be a navy, then I'll decide on what color. I'll audition all kinds of fabrics from my stash and see what I want to use for the outer border. And you'll see updates of that out on my Facebook page. I'll be posting pictures. Please make sure that you go out to my Quilting with Lori Scrap Up Your Stash group page and join us, and please post things that you are working on, and love to see photos of the quilts, the blocks that you're working on, and maybe the ideas on the layout that you're going to use for your log cabin on point. So don't forget to pull up that PDF that is in the description box below. I have the link down there so you can grab that and either print it or save it to your computer so that you'll have it for future use. But it'll give you the general information that you'll need to create the blocks, to create the sashing and so forth, all of the information that I've shared with you here today in this video. And make sure if you haven't watched the first video, part 1 of the Log Cabin on Point, that you do that. That is really important that you watch that so that you'll have an idea of how to put the blocks together. And then I would love to see your layout, so make sure you post that out on my Facebook page so I can see that. If you're enjoying the content that I'm providing you here on YouTube, I hope that you will like and subscribe to my channel. And I have so much more that's coming up. I've got another Scrappy block coming up for Monday and some more things for next week. So stay tuned for more fun, scrappy ways to use up your scrap stash. Happy quilting!